that we're going to stick with every time, hopefully. So don't go to Sterling, long story short. That's probably not where you want to be. Welcome back to week 2 of QWEB. Today we're going to do a little bit more HTML, then we're going to do CSS. Here's a quick recap of what we did last time. We mostly just did HTML last time. That's all that was really that important. We introduced our club website that we're going to work on throughout the following weeks. And today we're going to edit that same club page further. We're going to do a bit more HTML, and we're going to do some CSS to do some styling on our page. Week 3 is going to be Flexbox and JavaScript, and week 4 is when we'll finally actually do React, which is probably why you came out here at all. We're going to start off with some HTML, which is where we ended off last time. So first we can open up this club1.html page, and we'll see that it is our club page from the end of last time, right? We've got all of our headings, all of our text, all of our images. It's the exact same way that we started off last time. If you want to find this code, you can find it on our GitHub page. I sent a link in the Discord channel. The best way probably would be to head over to the GitHub page, hit this code button in the corner, click download zip, unzip it, head into the week folder that is this week. So this week is week 2, and you'll get all of the code that I'm working on. You don't have to write it out while I'm trying to write it out at the same time. You'll be able to just open it up that way. All right, so today we are going to continue to work on that club page. So first, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call it club2.html. And let's grab all of our previous code that we ended off last week with and copy that in. So this is exactly what we ended off the last week with. This probably looks pretty familiar. The first thing that we're going to do is go inside of our head tag here, and we're going to create a new tag, which is called a, sorry, I lied. We're going to go in our body tag here, and we're going to create a new tag, which is called a header. And a header isn't really anything special. If we actually save our file here, and if we go back and refresh the page, you'll notice that nothing actually happened. A header is like a div. It's one of those styling tags that we'll use a lot later, and it's really just to help us organize our code better. So a header is generally for the things at the top of a site. Maybe it's where your nav bar is, where you can click between the different pages. But for now, we're going to put our titles inside of a header tag. And if we save our page, and if we refresh here, you'll notice that nothing actually changed. This is more for the programmer than actually for displaying stuff on our site. From here, we're also going to change up this footer here at the bottom. We made a very basic one last time, but today we want to add some more to it. So if we head back to the bottom of our body tag here, here's our old footer. We're actually just going to add the new one right above it. And first thing we're going to do is create a footer tag. And the footer tag is just like the header tag that we did up here. It doesn't actually do anything. But this is more of a way for us to show both ourselves and other programmers that this is the footer. From here, we're actually going to create a link, and we're going to try to link ourselves to an email address. So this one I'm going to call contact@gmail.com. If I save the file and if I head over and refresh, we'll see that nothing actually is displayed here. And that's because we have forgotten to actually show where this link goes. So if we say href like we did last time, we can actually type in email, colon, and then type in an email address. So in this case, contact@gmail.com. And if we save it, and if we head over and open up our site here, you'll see that, we'll open up the wrong file. Give me a sec here. If we head over and open up our file, we'll see here that our contact thing at the bottom here is actually a link. And if we click on this, it will actually start to create an email for us. And it'll fill in the to section with contact@gmail.com because that's what we selected as our email. From here, we can also add one more type of link that we haven't shown off before, and that is for a phone number. So if we just type in our phone number, what do you want the phone number to be? Give me some numbers. 555. All fives? Great. So here's our phone number. We'll save the file, we'll refresh, and we'll see that it's just text. if we want this to be clickable, we can actually add a link. We'll use href just like we used before, and we have to tell the browser that this is a phone number, so we'll use TEL, TL standing for telephone, and then we'll type in our telephone number again. And we'll see here, if we save this, if we go back and we refresh, this is now a link, and if you click on this, your web browser will try to make a call, and in this case it wants to connect to my phone to carry out that call. But long story short, we can also create some other types of links than what we saw last time, and this is 2 examples of them. From there, I'm going to add some break lines in here just to make it a little bit prettier. We'll add a few more, and next we're just going to type in some text. So what do you guys want the footer of the site to say? Just give me a sentence, anything.
555 is not a real phone number.
Cool. So we'll type that in, and you'll see at on a lot of sites at the bottom of them, they'll often have some copyright information. So on ours, we're gonna say, hey, well, this is copyrighted of the year maybe 1996, and we're actually going to type the and symbol, copy, and then put a semicolon here, and you'll see that it will turn blue, and that's VS Code sort of telling you that this is a symbol. And if we actually save our page here, go over and refresh, we'll see that we actually input the copyright symbol onto our page without having to actually go online and find the symbol and copy it over. This is generally the way that you're going to want to do those symbols, because every web browser will display it slightly differently. Long story short, this is a best practice. From here, we have a more official looking footer here. Of course, we could delete our old one, and we just defined that little header at the top to hold these 2 items. From here, we're going to actually add another page to our site. So if I head into the club3 folder, we'll see that we have this club.html file, and other than one minor change, which I'll show you after, it's the exact same. So I'm just going to ask you to believe me on that. And the next file that we're going to add is actually going to be a Contact Us page. So we want a user to be able to maybe submit a form and give them some feedback. So we have defined a header here. We've given it a title, and that will change the tab title. And we've done a bunch of other stuff below, but probably the best thing to do first would be to have a quick peek at the file. So if I open up the contact page here, you can see what this looks like. Notice the tab title is Contact Us. That's because of the title tag that we defined earlier. We have this nav bar, which I'm actually going to skip over and we'll look at later. But the first thing we have here is called a section tag, and this is just like the header and the footer. This kind of is more for the programmer, and this just defines a section of your site, for lack of a better word. These tags will make a lot more sense once we start to do some styling, but for now, just realize that these are more for formatting and blocking things together so that you stay organized. From here, we're going to open up a form tag, and we're going to make a form. So first, we're going to add some text using a heading. We're going to use a div to sort of separate things out. That's all unimportant. But the first thing you'll notice here is we have this new tag called input. And input is how you actually are going to get something from the user. You're going to allow them to type something in, maybe select something, etc. So the first thing you'll notice is input doesn't have a closing tag. It's like image in that sense. And so you don't actually have to type any text within it. You just create the input tag itself. First thing you'll realize is that it has a type attribute. That is how you'll tell the input what you want the user to enter. So in this case, the first one I've said is text. The second one I've said is email. And there's a very slight difference between those, but there are a bunch of different input types that you can select at different variations, and you can read some documentation to get a list of all of those. The next thing I have is the ID. And the ID is sort of a unique thing that allows you to specifically look at this input tag. And that will get a lot more useful in week 3 when we do JavaScript. But for now, we're using that to say, hey, this is sort of our name input. It allows us to refer to it later. This may seem a bit cryptic. I can talk to you more about it if you'd like. But for now, let's say that this is a best practice when doing input. And we'll show you exactly why this is useful more in week 3. Then we have name, and in this case, the first one is called name, but this is actually a descriptor for what this value is storing. So when you submit a form, you're probably going to be sending it off to someone else, and we want to actually tell that person, or in this case, that program, what it actually is. And so in this case, this is holding a name, so we've set it for name. The second one's holding an email, etc. So if we go back over to our page here, you'll see, hey, we have our sort of input box here for a name, and we have our input box here for an email. And you'll realize when I click on them that my browser starts to auto-correct things based off of that type selector, right? So in this first one, it's entering in a bunch of variations of my name that I've typed in before, and under the email one, it's entering a bunch of emails that I've typed in before. And that is sort of where some of the benefits of actually defining a type for your form come in. Next, you'll realize that, hey, if we actually just take one of these inputs, and if we put another one on here and save our file, go back, refresh, we'll realize that an input doesn't actually have any text associated with it, right? We have to tell the user somehow what we want them to actually input. And so that's where the label tag comes in here. And so we defined a label. Within the label, we're showing the text that we want displayed, just like a paragraph or like any of the other tags that we've used earlier, so we'll type the text within it. The weird thing about label is it has this for attribute, and that is actually going to connect it to an input. So in this case, I've said for, and I've set it equal to name, and you'll realize that that is the exact same as the ID that we used for the input below it. And so we've linked together this label and this input, and that will become even more useful later on. But even for your web browser, this is a good way to show that this label is for this input box. We've got two of these sort of label and input sets, one for name and one for email. And then we have a slightly different one here that allows us to create a text area. And a text area is just a massive input box. You'll see that it has a name, it has an ID, and I've defined the columns and the rows, and that's just how big it is. So if we increase the columns to maybe 420 and we save the file and refresh, you'll notice that your input box becomes massive. And that's just a way that we can control how big it starts out. You'll notice that in the very corner of the input box, there's actually a little selector button here that allows you to resize it, and that will let the user resize it right on their screen. That won't change the size in general, because if they refresh the page and come back to it, it will still be the same size that you set it. From here, we've added some break lines. We've added another div just for sorting stuff out. That's not very important. We've added some text, and then we've added a new type of input called a radio. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It probably has a better CSE name. But this is a little button that you're able to select, and you can see them down here. And the important part about them is that you can only select one. So once I've selected the good button, if I go and select the OK button, I can't select two at a time, right? And so if we head back over here, we'll see that each one has a label. I'm using the for again. I've changed the type. And the only difference here is that this one has a value. And what happens is when we submit our form, we have to tell the form what this value actually is. So we have to say, hey, if you've selected this button, then the text that we want to provide is OK. And then if we select this button, then the text we want to provide is good. And that's what that value attribute actually does. Then here at the very bottom, I've added a button, and I've given the button the text of submit. Because this is a new tag, and well, it defines a button. It will let us actually click to submit our form. And so if I actually make my text area a little bit less insanely sized, just so that we can see, so let's make it like 30. If I save it, go back. So now here's our form. If I start to fill it out, I can put some text here. I can select maybe amazing. And if I actually open up the inspect page that we opened up at the end of the last lesson, we can actually see this form be submitted. Now, inspect opens up generally on the elements tag, which we saw last time. Here's all of our HTML on the side there. But if we hit these two sort of arrows, and if we go to the network tab, this will look a little bit cryptic, but realize how it says recording network activity there at the bottom. If I then go ahead and click submit on my form, first it's going to say, hey, you have a problem, and that's because I said that this field here should have an email address in it, and I didn't type an email. So my web browser is telling me, hey, this isn't valid input, and I need to type in an email. So if I add @gmail to this, and then if I click submit, you'll notice that it refreshes the page, but we have now a value over here in our recorded items. If I click on it, it will show some information over here. It has headers and previews and a response and all that stuff, but let's just look at the payload tab. If I give a little bit more space here, you'll notice that, hey, it has an attribute called name, and that's value is GELLO, and that's what I typed into the name spot. And it got this value of name here from the value of name right here. See how it's name here? What I typed in there is now equal to this name attribute. And I mean, this is like a dictionary if you've done Python before, but that's not important for right now. Let's abstract that away. And you'll notice that, hey, we have our email as well. We have our message, which is what we typed in this text area. And we have experience, which is set to amazing, exclamation mark. And that amazing was found from this value down here. If I define one of these little buttons, I can define a new one here really quickly. I can give it an ID of maybe hi. I can give it the name of experience like before. And I can close it off. I can save. I can go back. Here's my new button. If I then submit my form again really quickly here, you'll notice that I've selected that new button that I've created. If I click submit and if I go to the form's values, you'll notice that experience now has the value of on. And that may not be what you actually want. It turns out if you don't have a value associated with your button, it will just return on to you to tell you that the user clicked it. And so you'll have to manage if you want these values to be preset or if you want to do it another way. But long story short, that is how you can create a form in HTML. We can add a button to it and we can actually submit that form, and we can see the values that it submits by using the inspect window on our web browser. From there, we're actually going to switch off, and well, actually briefly, we'll show you sort of these links at the top of our page. Yeah.
How does the submit button work? I didn't see what that actually does.
Yeah, of course. So if we fill out our form here,
I know what it like submits something, but like I never saw how the submit button makes the submit go.
okay, so because my button is defined within a form, so you'll see I have form at the very top here. Let me just scroll out a little bit just to show this. You'll notice that I have a button within the form, right? The button has happened before my closing form value. And by default, if you have a button within a form, when you click that button, it will submit the form. Later on, we'll do a bunch of stuff with like changing how this button works. But suffice to say, if you make a button within a form and you click it, it will submit. Yeah?
Which of it submits the form, but submits it to where?
Right now, nowhere. Right now, what our page does is we fill out all this information, we click the submit button, and by default, HTML will refresh the page, and it will send that request off. We haven't defined anywhere with our button or with our form. If we go to the top, our form doesn't have any information about where it's going, and so by default, it is going somewhere, but we have no way of accessing that. And you can see exactly where your form goes if you actually click on the request that we found before, and if you click on headers here. And you'll see that it's actually just refreshing the page and getting it again, which seems a bit weird. There's a long-winded, better answer to your question that I can maybe answer at the end. But for now, let's just say that the form is submitting it off, and then it's actually going to get the website back because the form's been submitted. And that sounds a bit weird, but that's kind of what's happening. Well, what happens is the form sends off to a backend that doesn't exist. So it just sends that data off. And what happens by default in HTML when you submit a form is it refreshes the page to get the form ready for another submission. So actually, if you turn on, I think it's preserve log or something, and if you do this again, I think you should be able to see both requests come in, potentially. No, you can't. Okay. I'm sorry, this is very hard to explain without it, but what's kind of happening here is we're sending this form off. It doesn't really have anywhere to go. And so by default, HTML will refresh a page when a form has been submitted to reset the form. That's how I would explain it for now before we actually have a spot for this form to go off to. That may be a bit confusing. If you're still confused, talk to me after. I'll draw you a nice little diagram, and it'll make a little bit more sense. But for now, let's just say that the form's going off, and nothing's happening with that data, so we're going to refresh the page. All right, at the beginning here, I said, hey, we're going to make this little nav bar, and we're not going to worry about it until later. Here's that nav bar at the top, and it's just two links here. And what we've actually done is linked the two HTML files together. So you can actually click between them. And now we're starting to look a little bit closer to maybe a real website, right? It doesn't look great. It looks very ugly. It looks 2000s era. But you can actually use this. And so If you'll look back at our code here, you'll see that we've defined this nav tag, which is just like the header. It's just how we're going to show that this is where our navigational items are going to be. And then we've created these two links, and instead of linking to a website on the web, we're going to link to an HTML file. So in this case, we're linking to club.html and contact.html to create those two buttons, or in this case, actually links, to create those two links. And we can go directly to these two files because they're in the same folder. And if you had it somewhere else, you would have to give the entire directory to where it is. But for now, because they're in the same folder, we can just give the file name. From here, we're actually going to switch off of HTML, and we're going to start to do some CSS. And CSS is the main way that you're going to style your site. It's more of a markdowny language, but whether it's a programming language or not, that's for you to decide. I'm not going to make that ruling because someone will get mad at me. But for today, we're going to use it to sort of change fonts, colors, change the way images are displayed, maybe change a table. All of that sort of stuff is what CSS is for. And you may think, hey, why are we spending so much time on HTML and CSS if we're going to go into React later? And the reason is, even when you're writing React code, you're going to want to style it somehow, right? You don't want your website to look like this when it's finished because it's ugly, it's gross, and no one wants to use that. And that's when your CSS and your HTML are going to come in so that you can actually make your website look good. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it maybe club4, and I will create a club.html file and a contact.html file, and I'll copy over our finished versions from last time. So there's the club page, there's the contact page, and I'll save those. So now we're exactly where we started from before. Nothing has actually changed. Perfect. Next, we're going to define a new HTML tag, but it's really for CSS. And we're going to do it within the head at the very top of our page, and that is called style. And whoops, style is where you are able to define CSS right in your HTML file. So in this case, CSS works in a way in which you have to select something on your site. So if we look at our home page here, we have a bunch of stuff. We have headings, we have images, we have text, and we can select these based off of their HTML elements, right? So remember before, this is an H1, we have an H3 below it, and the first way in CSS that we can select stuff is actually by using that tag. So if we say H3, and we open some curly braces here, we are now going to select all of the H3s or the heading 3s on our page, and we're going to apply some styling to them. So does anyone have a favorite color?
Green.
Perfect, green. So I'm going to say, hey, the background color of all of the H3s are going to be green. And we're going to end each line with a semicolon. And if we save this and actually find that file, club, you'll realize that, hey, all of the H3s now have a background color of green. And it looks wonderful. There are a bunch of other tags that you can use. One of them is font family, so we can change the font. So I'm just going to make it sans serif because I know that one works. We can add some padding, which we're not really sure what quite it is yet, but for now, let's just say that it's some extra space, and it's defined sort of in the size of pixels. So this is 10 pixels of padding. If we save and refresh, we'll notice that there's some space around the text. There are a bunch of other CSS tags, and CSS is one of those languages where it's probably best just to Google what exactly you're looking for. If you want to change a background color, Google that tag. But there's also built-in documentation where if I select this background color right in VS Code, I can click on this reference page and click open, and it will actually open up to a documentation page all about background color. And it will show you some examples that you can actually click on here, and it'll give you all of the information that you possibly need. And you'll realize as a web developer very early on that this documentation is definitely your friend. There's no way you'll be able to memorize all of this stuff, and you'll constantly be looking for things that you've done before. From here, we also have another way of actually applying some styling to our page. If we head down maybe to the header tag here, we're actually going to define a span. And a span is basically a div just for styling. The only reason this tag exists is so that you can apply some styling to it and not sort of crowd out your code and make it look very ugly. So I've made a span here and surrounded it within people, and that span is within this H1 tag. If I save the file here, and if I head back over and refresh, we'll realize that nothing happened, and that's good. our span tag doesn't have any styling applied to it yet. The next thing that we'll do is we'll actually give this span tag a style attribute. So if I type style and hit equals, now we can type some CSS right onto this HTML element, and we can say, hey, I want this one to be the color of orange. I can save the file, I can refresh, and we'll see that just the word people on this page then becomes orange. From here, you'll notice that, hey, maybe the style tag at the top of your page could get very long, and maybe using individual spans throughout your whole file is going to make it a bit messy. CSS also allows us to create style sheets, which is essentially its own CSS file. And we're going to create one here, and we're going to call it stylesheet.css. And in this file, we can type exclusively CSS. So let's say, hey, we'll grab the body tag, which is essentially our entire website, because everything's within the body. If you come back over to Club here, almost everything on our website is within this body tag. And then we can apply some styling to that. So I'm going to make it the color of red maybe, and I'll change the font family and make it sans serif for fun. Now if I save that, if I go back to our site and refresh, we'll notice that nothing happens. Unfortunately, we haven't actually told our HTML file to use the styling within the CSS file. And we're going to have to do that, otherwise it won't know where to look. So if we head back over to our club page, and if we go into our header here, we can actually define what's called a link sort of attribute here, and we can give it an href, which is a link to something, and we're just going to say stylesheet.css. This is just like how we linked to our other HTML files before, and because it is in the exact same folder, we can just give the file name. Then we're going to say rel, which is going to tell this link what we're actually linking, and we're going to say style sheet, because we're linking to a style sheet. We're going to save this, and we're going to head back over and refresh, and we'll realize that all of the text now becomes red, and it looks glorious if you were a supervillain. From here, we can continue to apply styling in other ways. If we head back over to our style sheet, and if I type .navbar, we can then style things based off of a class name. And if I say .navbar, then if I say maybe background color can be gray, and maybe I say the width is 100%, and maybe I say the padding is 50 pixels, right? If I save this, and if I head back over to my site and refresh, nothing actually happens, because nothing on our HTML actually has a class name. And a class is just like an attribute from before. It's just like the style one, and it can be applied to basically anything. So if I head over to our nav tag here, if I give it a class, I can call this maybe navbar. And if I save it, and if I refresh, we'll notice that the gray background and all the padding is now there. This is probably the best way for you to write CSS. You write all of your CSS within a separate style sheet CSS file. You can use the dot to say, hey, we want to select a class name, and then we can give the name of a class. And then we head back over to our HTML page, and we find things on our page that we want to give this styling to. In this case, we want to give it to the navbar, so we're going to say class equals navbar. You can give something multiple classes by separating them with a space, but we can then go through our site, and we can assign this navbar to anything we want. If we want to assign it to this h3, we can also give it navbar, and if we save it and refresh, we'll realize that h3 gets the exact same styling that the navbar did. We also have one more way of selecting elements. I mean, of course, there are other ways, but generally for now, we're going to say we have one more way, and that is actually selecting from their ID. So if you remember from our Contact Us form, we defined a bunch of IDs for all of the input tags and stuff like that. So if I say hashtag, I can select based on ID, right? Period for class, hashtag for ID. And so I can say, hey, maybe I'll grab the contact form, and I'm going to give it a background color. And you can actually define your background color very specifically using RGB. So if you type RGB, right, standing for red, green, and blue, you could start to type numerical values up to 255 in here. So if you find a specific color, maybe online, you can convert it to RGB and get that exact color on your site. And you'll notice when you type these in, VS Code always gives you a little box of what that color looks like for you. I can also maybe say, hey, the color is white, and I don't know, maybe I'll add some padding, and maybe I'll add some margin. We'll get into the difference of padding and margin very briefly later, but just know for now that these add some extra space. So if I go back over to our page and if I refresh, I'll notice that nothing happens. And that's because nothing on my page right now in this club.html page has an ID of contact-form. So it's not being applied to anything. If I head over to my contact page, maybe I'll say, hey, I want this form to have the ID of contact form, and I'll save it. And now if I head over to the Contact Us page, unfortunately nothing happens. And that's because, once again, we forgot to link our style sheet to our contact page. So if I grab this exact same link that we used in our HTML page, if I head back over to contact, and if I put this into my header, right, we're going to link once again to the style sheet. I go back to the Contact Us page, and if I refresh, you'll notice that all of the styling that we just defined got applied to the form element, and it got applied to the form element because it had the ID of contact-form. From here, we can just define some other styling as sort of a brief review for CSS. So we can actually give it, maybe we'll give navbar, nav-link some styling. I don't know, we can give it a color, and we can continue to do this for all of the items on our site. From here, we're actually going to do something a little bit different, and this is one of the ways that you can make your site feel a little bit more interactive, and that is to define what's called a hover. So CSS will let you apply some styling only when you're hovering over that element. So if I say maybe .nav-link, and if I do a colon and then type hover, I can now maybe, hey, I want to make these links a different color whenever I hover over them. So in this case, I'll make them this orange color. And if I save this, if I head back over to my contact page, I'm then going to give these both the class of navlink, right? Because I want to apply that styling. Got an extra colon in there. There we go. So now if I refresh, you'll see that I gave them the styling of navbar, which makes their background color gray, which makes it very hard to see. Navlink, which makes their color white, which is why we can't see the text anymore. If I select it here, you'll see that it shows up now. But if I change this maybe to something like blue and refresh, there we go. Our navbar is still there. Now if I zoom in a lot, you'll see that if I actually hover over the navbar, it will change to orange. And that's because it's now applying the CSS styling within the hover. So we can dynamically change stuff on our site based on whether you're hovering. So I could then make maybe the font size 100 pixels, and you'll notice when I hover over this and refresh, you'll notice when I hover over this, it becomes massive. Bum, bum, bum. We can also select specific elements that are only in a certain spot on our website. So if we were to, for example, say, maybe we only want to grab a specific heading that's within a form, right? So here's a heading, and it's within this big form. So I can say, hey, I want to grab all of the forms on my site, and then, hey, I only want to grab the H3s. I can then give a space, and if I type H3, I'll only grab the headings within a form. So first it will check for a form, and then it will check for a heading within that form, and then of course we can apply some styling. We can maybe change the font size, and we can maybe give it some padding on the left. And if we refresh our page here, you'll see that the heading within our form becomes massive. But if I go back to our Contact Us page, and if I define a heading with outside, an H3 specifically with outside of this form, maybe it'll just say hi for now and refresh, that heading is normal. It doesn't have that styling. And that's because first it checks for a form, and then it checks for that heading. From here, we'll just move on very quickly into this club 4 file here. And you'll notice that it's pretty similar to what I just wrote out, except it has some extra style, or sorry, club 5 here, and it has some extra class names and some extra styling that we haven't done before. If we head into the style here, you'll see, hey, maybe it's got one for body and all of these nav links. We're using some hovers here. We're even hovering over images. You can do that as well as just links. And if I show you the site here, you'll realize that we've defined something for when we hover over this image. It moves it very slightly. It's kind of hard to see. It's just added a little bit of space. and that's another instance of using that hover. If we go back to our club page, you'll realize that that image has the class of blog image link, right? You'll see it right here. It has that class, and that's how that styling was added to it. From there, we've defined some silly and fun styling at the bottom here, in which case we have defined a rainbow class where we set the background to a linear gradient, and that just makes a gradient. We've made the angle 90 degrees. I don't know, we just picked 90 for fun, and then we've listed a bunch of colors here. We've given it red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, and that is going to actually create a gradient. So if I head back over to my site and refresh, you'd think that somewhere this gradient would show up, and your first thought may be, hey, maybe you don't have the rainbow class anywhere. If I actually check my club page, I'll notice that this check out our blog post below has the rainbow tag, so that's not the problem. The issue is, unfortunately, we only created a gradient for a background, right? We set the background to a gradient. Well, unfortunately, the text is over top of the background. It's taking up that space, and so you'll notice if we hover over it, it becomes rainbow colored. And that's because we defined this hover tag here. We've selected all of the classes with rainbow, and we've said when we hover over them, we actually want to make their color transparent. And that's making the text color transparent, and so the background will be able to be seen through it. We've also defined a transition, which essentially defines how fast we want this hover animation to happen. We can change the speed of it. We can make it maybe 1,000 milliseconds, and if we head back over, you'll see that it takes a bit longer. Yes?
What's the benefit of doing the background, having the text be transparent so it shows the background versus just changing the color of the text itself?
There is no benefit. We wanted to show off hover one more time and show you how a transition would work. Generally, yeah, you'll just want to set the text color. Sometimes it can be helpful, but 99% of the time, just set the text color. It'll be easier. Yeah. So that is, if we sort of check out both of these, this is sort of the final version of our site for this week. We've added some styling to our nav bar here, made it a bit bigger. Notice people's a different color. We have changed what happens when we hover over a bunch of items on our page. We've added some links. We've added a footer. We've added a Contact Us page, which has even more styling on it. And one of the first things that you will have noticed probably while I was typing out all of this CSS is that we have a bunch of different ways to do it. And at the beginning, I sort of said, hey, you want to define all of your CSS in a separate file and import it, just trust me, do that. And so now I'm going to actually show you why I said that and why you want to do that. So if you actually open up this CSS folder here, if you have this open as well, I have this file called inlinemessy.html defined. And if you open it up, this looks like our club website. It looks the exact same. It's got all of the styling on it, except for those hover values. Unfortunately, if we hover over, check out our blog post below, nothing happens. And that's because you can't define anything to be hoverable with inline CSS. You just can't do it. It won't let you. If I head over to my VS Code, and if I open up this file, inline messy, you'll see that we have defined all of the CSS using inline styling. So we've typed out style for all of the tags. And you'll notice that it honestly creates a bit of a mess, right? This HTML file is very long, and it's actually kind of hard to read now. There's also another way that you can do your HTML. If you recall to the beginning, you can create a style tag at the very top of your file, right? And here's a quick example of one. And so your next thought would be, hey, I'm not going to create a separate CSS file. I'm just going to define it within that style tag. And so here is an example of that happening. And you'll notice if I hover over here at the bottom that a rainbow effect does actually work. You can define all of your CSS within a style tag at the top of your page, except suddenly your HTML file is going to look something like this, and most of it at the top is going to be taken up with all of your CSS styling. And this is bad because, well, we want our HTML pages to just be HTML. We want them to just be the content of the site. We don't want them to be bogged down with a bunch of CSS. And also, this reduces our reusability. What about the fact that, hey, I want to use the exact same navbar styling on both my home page and my Contact Us page? I can no longer do that. I have to copy and paste the styling from this club page. I have to copy and paste it over to the Contact Us page to get that styling to apply. And if I don't do that, our Contact Us page won't have any styling. if I delete my link to it, and if I open up Messy Contact Us, you'll notice it has no styling. If I open up the messy one, and if I copy over all of this style, it will look very similar to the first page. But you've probably learned in computer science so far that when you're copying and pasting code a bunch of different files, if you change one of them on one file, you now are going to have to duplicate that change across all of the files, and suddenly you have a 10-page website in which you want to change the font size from something dumb like 12 pixels to 13 pixels because someone told you to, and unfortunately you have to go through all 10 of your files in order to make that change. And that is why we define all of our CSS in a separate file called stylesheet or something similar .css so that we can import it at any time we want into any project we want and even reuse it later. This is the best way for us to reuse our CSS, and that's why we use these style.css files. From there, I've got one more quick brief thing. So far, we've just been throwing a lot of information at you. I highly suggest you spend maybe even just 30 minutes and you try to actually apply some of this stuff. Maybe you look at our code and you try to make your own site. My suggestion would be, hey, maybe try to make a portfolio site for yourself and update it at the end of every week as we go through our weeks. Eventually, by the end, you'll have your very own React portfolio site, and myself as well as the TAs can help you as you continue to do that. One of our TAs actually has an old personal site here that I can show you that is created only with HTML and CSS. And so yeah, you'll want to add some of the cool React stuff maybe later, but you can see that you can create a very good looking site by just using HTML and CSS. And so that would be my #1 suggestion to you, is even if it's only for a few minutes, if you can, try to apply all of this stuff into your own project. And that's where the real learning works. That's where you start to ask questions, and you can ask them to myself or the TAs or the Discord server, or you can just straight up Google them. But my #1 suggestion to you would be the best way to learn is to try to start a project. And start small and continue to update it throughout the weeks. That's it for me, unless you guys have any more questions. I think this converts into a social again afterwards. But if you have anything to say, let me know. You can come and talk to me after as well. Thank you for coming.